Good morning, everyone. As Trey said, I'm Steve Metz of the Strategic Studies Institute. And General Rapp mentioned yesterday when he was kicking off the conference that this is the 28th Strategic Studies Institute Strategy Conference. I've actually been involved in 24 of those, which I think is the record. My first involvement was a presentation here even before I came to work at the War College. So I would like to compliment Trey Braun and his SSI team on sustaining the tradition of excellence that's developed at the conference over the years. And I can tell you there have been some really important big ideas that have come out of this conference over the decades. I mean, you look at, for example, Fred Kaplan's book, The Insurgents, talks about some things that happened here. So I'm really convinced that the same is going to be true this year, and some of the ideas that originate, percolate, grow out of this event will go on to resonate within the security community. We all know that the focus of this year's conference has been on the changing character of war. This particular session, though, is going to do something a little different. As Professor Braun mentioned, we're going to kind of turn the telescope around. And the issue that we're going to look at during this panel is not how is the character of war changing out there in the world, but how are the changes in the character of war affecting the United States? We're going to talk about how things that are going on in the character of war, from what Dexter Filkins called the forever war, the emergence of cyber, the emergence of social media, the potential emergence of artificial intelligence and robotics. How is that affecting the United States economically, culturally, politically, socially? A lot of times when you build a panel like this, and you're trying to decide who to incorporate on it, you sit down and go, okay, do I want to emphasize expertise, or do I want to emphasize people who are interesting? Luckily for me, I didn't have to make that decision, because I was able to come up with a group of people that really are both of those things in spades. So our panelists today are Robb, Preble, and Tammy Schultz. You all have their bios, so I'm really not going to go into any detail on it. If you haven't looked at them, I would encourage you to look at their bios. All do have years and decades of thinking about not only the American military, but the security environment in general. And they are all people who really do combine deep expertise with interesting perspectives. And as Professor Braun mentioned, we're going to approach this panel a little differently, because rather than have the panelists give a presentation as the other panelists did, the intention is for the entire panel to be a discussion. So, I've told them to not come with prepared comments. I'm going to kick off by asking all of the panelists a general question. But as they answer, what I would like to do is to shift it to you in the audience, in our virtual audience, as quickly as possible. So from the beginning, begin thinking about what interests you, what you think is important, what kind of challenges you face in your career in terms of how the changing security environment, the changing character of war is coming back home and affecting the United States. So with that said, let me just kind of throw out the first question, and this is for all three of our panelists. And the first kind of overarching question is, what do you think is the most important effect that the changing character of war, the changing security environment is having on the United States and on Americans today? And Tammy, we'll start with you, and then work this way.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Steve. I'm the interesting one with no expertise. I'm also a political scientist, and I know there's a lot of students in the audience, so I would be remiss if I didn't say we're playing in the area of constructivism here, which is one of the theories you learned about and probably forgot. But it basically says that actors have an effect on the system in terms of identifying norms, cultures, all that sort of stuff, and that the system has an effect on the actors. We're obviously looking at the former here on this panel. Easiest example, if the United States doesn't win World War II, the system that is produced from that looks very different than it otherwise would. so a couple of caveats. The second thing I'll mention is correlation doesn't mean causation. So in thinking about this general topic, I've got some ideas, but I am sort of leery of any monocausal explanations for anything so complicated as what we're dealing with today. So there's other factors, I think, besides the changing character of war that may be at play, and almost certainly are. The third, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to go to all the discussions because I'm sure they're very interesting. I'm not so sure the character of war is changing. I just wrote a piece reviewing Rosa Brooks, how war became everything and the military became everything or something like that, where she made a similar argument. And I sort of fall in the Clausewitzian school, whereby I think, and I asked Dr. Cohn at one point when I was his student, what would it take for Clausewitz to go out the window in terms of war? And his bow tie spun and his mustache kind of like went a little bit. And he basically, if you know him, that's funny. And I love the guy. And he basically said war would have to be no longer about policy. And while I think some of the non-state actors, like I was looking at Al-Qaeda in around 1998, as I was just talking to John about, ISIL, there's nihilism there, there is a religious aspect. Certainly there are political goals, like the United States should get out of Saudi Arabia, ISIL's trying to hold territory. So we might be skirting against that, but I'm not so sure the actual character's changing. That aside, to directly answer your question shortly, Steve, there's a couple things that I think are changing, but the overarching argument would be, I fear that the United States citizens' relationship to the state, to the United States, is changing. And I see that in a few ways. First of all, our involvement in war. So I think war today is largely being hidden from the United States. It's sort of from the United States citizenry. And I see that in a few ways. Lots of students here. This will be interesting at cocktail parties. When's the last time the United States declared war? Just shout it out. When in World War II?
No.
Not 1941.
Romania.
42 against whom? Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. So I've just saved you a lifeline if you're ever on Jeopardy or whatever it is, something like that. So a lot of people, so the fact that I think that that's important because I think our founders actually, and war in some ways is the most intense, in some ways almost intimate relationship a citizen I think can have with the state. And I think our founders knew that. And so that's why there was the provision to actually declare war while the commander-in-chief was the president. Some people I've talked to who are representatives, senators, say it's not a problem because they're still the funding lever. So if there's an action that's not agreed with, they can simply vote in terms of funding. I find that an unsatisfactory answer because then you would be punishing the troops. So I think that there is something to be said for the fact we haven't even declared war. But it's seen in other ways. The all-volunteer force, less than 1% serves. That was in response to Vietnam and the Abrams Doctrine, where you put a lot of the combat support and combat service support in the reserves. The idea being that it would touch communities. War would touch communities then. That's had sort of, in many ways, what I think was an unintended consequence of shifting the reserves from a strategic reserve to an operational reserve. And I don't think we've figured that out yet. And I think that will come back to bite us. There's no victory gardens that existed during World War II, completely unnecessary, but made the public believe that they were supporting the war effort. No tax increases to pay for these wars. We were told to go shopping after 9/11. And it's not just a President Bush issue. So President Clinton, for instance, just with Bosnia and Kosovo, that came out of your O&M funds, your operation and maintenance accounts. It wasn't paid for by increased taxes or anything like that. So I don't think we're supposed to give long answers, so I'll pretty much, drone strikes, even against US citizens. I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that the relationship between the citizen and the state, specifically as it involves war, has changed. And I'll leave it at that, so because I know we want to have a discussion.
John?
The framework I use for making sense of what's going on is the biggest change I see is connectivity. Connectivity is changing, the character of war, at least in terms of how we get into it and how we resolve it. Both logical and physical connectivity. It's been causing the biggest problem for us over the last 2 decades. More so than the great power war, which is frozen in a nuclear stalemate, or a conventional war, which is caught in a demographic trap where most of the major countries in the world are all getting older and less likely to fight. They just don't have the young people to send out to war, which makes them less likely to do so. Connectivity, what I mean is we saw initial phase, which we responded to both nationally and globally pretty ineffectively, that occurred over the first decade of this century. And now we're seeing a new phase in the online social networking world. The first phase was something I called global guerrillas. I put that in, I did write a book way back then called Brave New War. It was about small groups of people, superpowered individuals who could use the online environment, could use online connectivity and communication, as well as globalization and the ability to move great distances in very short periods of time, porous borders, everything that came with globalization to break systems, break mostly physical systems. We saw that with kick off, pretty decisively with Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Our response to that was conventional war, and which is largely proven out to be a pretty ineffective, not a good response. Not only have we destabilized the region, more so than when we went in, we've spent $2 trillion doing it. That's the latest tab on Iraq. $4 trillion in interest on top of that. I mean, with $2 trillion, you could build a permanent colony on Mars, or rebuild all our air and train infrastructure from scratch up to modern standards. I mean, that's a lot of money. A lot of American greatness goes with that. It's put away, it's put aside. I mean, the middle class in the U.S. continues to decline as a result. It also affected the global economy. The global guerrillas, for instance, in Nigeria's Mend, Henry Oka there, broke pipelines that delivered about 1 million barrels of oil to the market. He did that, reached his peak about 2007, early 2007. At the same time, the Iraqi guerrillas were breaking pipelines in Iraq and prevented the oil production from getting above pre-war norms. The result was $147 a barrel of oil, which killed the global economy. Everything just went to a screeching halt. And all the leverage on Wall Street all became apparent. When the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked. Well, in this case, the entire global economy was leveraged to the hilt, and it imploded. It almost took us all down. And the growth that we've lost in the last decade and a half as a result of that has been pretty phenomenal. We're talking not just a couple $1 trillion, we're talking tens of trillions of dollars in lost growth, and lost not just nationally but globally. The new phase is something that we just experienced in this last election. The online social networking world has just exploded. I started working on that technology back in 2001. We did the basics of RSS and blogging and podcasting and all those networking blogs, and that became Facebook and became Twitter. And they just a year and a half ago went past 1 billion people. Now there are about 2.5 billion people socially networked around the world. 1.6 billion use it every day. About 60% of them use that for news. That's their primary news source. 1 billion people. Now compare that to TV news and everything else. All the established media, they're a rounding error. A good TV news program is about 1 million people. On CNN, watching it. We're talking 1 billion people on Facebook every day getting their news. And it's not the conventional news. It's spun, it's repurposed, it's different. And that's causing a great deal of tribalization. If you noticed, if you had a Facebook friends list that had different groups of people in this last election, you had libertarians or pro-Trump, pro-Hillary, pro-Stein, pro-Sanders, you'd see that their news feeds were entirely separate. They did not cross. They were tribalized or siloed. And they were reinforced by likes and how people reinforced their friends and told them to only think one way. And you dissociated with other people. So that tribalization has caused all sorts of dislocation. It doesn't have real-world effects other than elections. It did in the Arab Spring that swept, knocked out governments from Tunisia, and had effects on Libya, Egypt, and then Syria. All of those effects were in part caused by social networking. I had a recent use of it in the Turkish coup, or at least the fake coup, that where social networking was key in managing that situation. And it had a huge effect on our own election. It actually reached the scale where it could actually have an effect on us. And granted, we were primed for it because of decades of middle-class decline. But the fact that small groups of people using social networking, whether it's Russia, the $30 million that Russia spent on social networking attacks on the U.S., or 4chan, which is, and all the U.S. groups, which were far larger, and they're using the same bot technology that the Russians were, had more of an effect, is debatable, but it really changed the way politics operates in the U.S. I mean, that Trump was then able to bypass all of the traditional media, all of the gating functions that typically select what's talked about and who gets to run and who gets to become president, and he did it effectively. He hasn't been able to mobilize that since he's been in office, since it looks like he's changing his position on everything. But it was very interesting to see how that's operating. It also operated in Brexit. And this is just the beginning of it. It's going to increase in frequency. The stabilization we see in politics could cause the conflicts and wars that we'll have to deal with over the next couple of decades. So we have to get smarter in terms of how we deal with that.
Chris?
Well, again, thanks, Steve, for inviting me. It's great to be here. And I agree with everything that Tammy and John have said, and I will probably come back to some of those things. But my one response to this question, very particular to the question of the character of war, is we don't win anymore. We don't win wars. We have this paradox of increasing lethality and diminishing political effects. There's a reason why old dead Carl is out there in the hallway there. And Article 1, Section 1, know the war you're fighting, know what object you are trying to achieve. And I think too many people in the United States, especially people in the United States who have no experience with the military, imagine that these things automatically go together. If you can kill with precision, then therefore there will be political effects that you intend. Now, we all know better, right? But because for the reasons that Tammy already alluded to, we have this problem of the separation between the society that we serve and the people who serve, right? There's this huge disconnect. And so we imagine what the military effects are on the basis of, infrequent contact with people, but mostly through movies and TV. And so I guess we shouldn't be so shocked that the public is shocked that this incredible, powerful military can't win. Now, the response to that, once that has sort of sunk in, and it has, the response is actually pretty straightforward. You try harder or you stop trying. One of those two things. President Trump talked about we're going to win so much that you're going to get tired of winning. So we understood what his approach was. His approach was to try harder. And yet, there are a fair number of folks who voted for him, especially in the middle class that John was referring to, who are of the stop trying mentality. It's like, screw it. What's the point? If it's not going to work, let's just do something else. Let's spend some of that money here at home. Let's nation build at home. We saw that and we heard that narrative over and over and over again in the 2016 campaign. And I do think the president was sort of speaking simultaneously to both impulses, which I think is impossible to do. Now, in fairness, this disconnect between military effectiveness and political ends is not so new. We recall sort of Lyndon Johnson's reaction to Vietnamese being killed in large numbers and not doing what he wanted them to do, and the metrics that were used to measure that war. So this is not a new phenomenon. I think related to that, the great danger is that we won't stop trying, and yet it's still going to be very hard to achieve the political ends we seek with the military instruments that we have. And we'll get back to that, I hope, over the course of the discussion. But I just mostly want to second what Tammy and John said, but also add this third point about, again, very specific to the relationship between the wars that our military fights and the political ends that the political leaders have asked it to achieve.
I have several pages of questions myself I've written now, but let me flip it out here now. Are there questions that have popped into your mind at this point? Yeah, in the back, ma'am.
I apologize. I didn't have a chance to look at the panel's biographies. Just wanted to see if you could possibly share what your background is and what organization you are with.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So I work at the Cato Institute's think tank in Washington, D.C. I've been there for 14 years. I'm a historian by training. I got my PhD at Temple in Philadelphia. And between graduate school and undergraduate, I served 4 years in the United States Navy. I was a Navy ROTC in college and a surface warfare officer.
Air Force pilot, special ops, tier 1 counterterrorism kind of thing, and then I did tech analyst at Forrester. I was their first internet analyst, and then I did a bunch of companies, mostly software companies in finance, mostly global systems and built, and then I did Global Guerrillas, which is my blog, and Brave New War, and consulted with a bunch of companies, and the DoD and NSA and CIA. Most recently, I was working on the JCS concept for robotics, which hopefully we get to talk about.
I'm Tammy Schultz. I'm the Director of National Security and Joint Warfare at the Marine Corps War College. I'm not going to give you my long bio, but needless to say, I speak for myself.
Yep.
Good afternoon, John Mark Wilson, Seminar 8. For Mr. Robb, last week I read your piece on the United Airlines, and you talked about how corporations are becoming more driven by algorithms and autocratic hierarchical structures and decision making. Do you see any of that playing out in the international order today?
Oh, wow. Algorithmic decision making,
By the way, you've got 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll do it really quick. It's everywhere.
Or we'll have you reaccommodated after 30 seconds.
We'll reaccommodate you.
Yeah, the idea was that, United was set up for failure. I mean, it went through the algorithms from the moment that deadhead crew turned up at the gate and said, we need 4 seats on an already boarded plane. They went downhill from there because the corporate algorithm said you have to get them those seats. And then the corporate algorithm set the price that they could offer, which wasn't enough to get people out of those seats. And then the corporate algorithm figured out which 4 customers were the worst customers based on frequent flyer miles, the price of the ticket and everything. And it said, these are the 4 worst customers, kick them off. And from the moment this post 9/11 flight crew turned up, as soon as they went and told these people that they had to leave, the first no that they got was like, hey, wait a second, I'm a post 9/11 flight crew. You don't tell me no, you go. And that just initiated the police being called, and as soon as the police asked him to go, he said no. They're saying, we're police, and this is an aircraft, and this is post 9/11. Off you go. And it was just failure, failure, failure. It didn't have any kind of built-in, fire break for human decision-making. didn't have like when you have all these algorithms that are making all these decisions for your organization, you've got to make sure that you know where they are embedded in your organization. You have to build the circuit breakers for people to actually make decisions and hold up their hand and say, things are going badly. Things are not working out the way we thought they would. You have to have the ability, I would suggest even having a SWAT team of people who know how to deal with, if you're in a company, knew how to deal with customers and negotiate. That you can call up on a cell phone, which is easy, 24/7, and say, I have a problem. What can I do with this? And they can give you solutions. Like, for instance, asking the people on the plane saying, I have a doctor that needs to get back. We want to keep him in the seat. Would anyone else volunteer to get off?
Right.
And they would have had hands.
Right.
It wasn't just a money thing.
Right.
So that's, algorithms are going to keep proliferating. They're making decisions for us all the time. For instance, in our news right now, it's all being filtered by algorithm, by Facebook and everybody else. And those are going to get more and more complex. Knowing what they are and how to modify them is pretty critical.
To answer your, that was a fantastic piece. I think, and I know you didn't direct this at me, but that's never stopped me before. I think one of the algorithms the national security community has is that alliances are always good, and that it's just the default. And so I think President Trump is challenging the national security community in potentially some good ways, in the sense that making us revisit things that we've just sort of taken, at face value. So for instance, do we really want to get into a war with China over South Korea? Maybe, but I think that's something worth, the idea that alliances always equal stronger security, I think is something worth revisiting. I'm not saying that my personal stance is that we should, for instance, get out of a NATO or not honor those treaties. But I think that there are some sort of algorithms, some axioms sort of built into the system that have not been questioned for a very long time. That maybe Trump is sort of one of these
you're exactly
circuit
right.
breakers, right?
Yeah.
That sort of says, hey, but wait, right?
Well, and actually, it's okay. Yeah, the question wasn't directed to me either, but now that Tammy did it, I can follow on. I thought something that General McKenzie said yesterday relates to this: is that how do you affect change in an environment where you haven't suffered a catastrophic strategic defeat? If the attitude is, well, things are going reasonably well, let's just keep doing what we're doing. Under that circumstance, when does change occur? Well, the answer is after it's too late, right? So I think that, I think President Trump has sort of shuffled the deck here a little bit. That's
Maybe
a
on
good
the
thing.
Titanic, but we'll see.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And let me emphasize a phrase that John used that I think was really, really important, kind of getting at the main idea of this panel, and that's a post-9/11 flight crew. Mm-hmm. Because what now, almost 16 years of involvement in a type of conflict primarily involved with terrorism has done to us as a nation is, kind of three things kind of popped into my mind as he was talking about that. First of all, it's created, we've all to some degree become accustomed to a disrespectful, even intrusive security intervention in our privacy. But at the same time, in recent years, we've also become increasingly frustrated, even angry and resistant at us. And the other point that he made there in terms of the post-9/11 mentality is it's created a different mindset in the people who are specifically in the security business in terms of kind of the way they would deal with people who were not combatants, a type of aggressiveness that might not have been there before our involvement in the long war, GWAT, or whatever you want to call it. So actually, I hadn't really thought about that before, but this United Airlines thing, actually, it does really encapsulate and illustrate a lot of the kind of psychological, cultural changes, just the way we deal with authority has changed in the United States, in part because of the changing character of the conflict we're involved in. Yep. Sidney?
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. To pull on the algorithm thread, and one of the big themes of third offset and military future thinking overall is let's get more algorithms in the system. Let's have more artificial intelligence. Let's have, not just, robots strolling around, but have computers that are performing as decision aids, doing big data analysis and saying to the commanders, here's what we think the situation is, here are, several courses of action. And now there's the insistence human will always be in or on the loop, that there'll never be the computer actually pulling the trigger, except maybe sometimes. But what are the pitfalls there that we've seen from application of algorithmic decision making in the commercial world? Things where computer plus human is actually less than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the end of the cycle of the standard algorithmic approach, where you have the engineered solution. One of the biggest changes, and I watched the robotics discussion yesterday, and he didn't even mention it, was the impact of AI deep learning. Every single big tech company now is an AI company. You got Facebook, Google, Tesla, Uber, et cetera, et cetera. They're all AI companies now. Their future and everything that they're doing is to accumulate the data and accumulate the training experience necessary to build amazing AIs. And that's ultimately going to have to be the future of the US military too. And these AIs are not like human level AIs. I mean, you don't want to replicate a human being, but you have in that very narrow sense a computer that understands. It's a difference between computers that you engineer, algorithms that you engineer, never have enough caveats, never have enough sense to always make good decisions. They break often. But these new systems are built through exposure to data, exposure to experience. You train them, right? And they understand, okay? And the fact that you're training them is that you test them differently. You certify them for action. And you see the effectiveness of this stuff. This stuff actually works. I mean, in terms of voice recognition, in terms of image recognition, the cool part about it and the scary part about it at the same time is that the models that they're making, these simulated neural nets on these big GPU graphics processor clusters, they're opaque. We don't know what they are. I mean, they're not based on physics and they're not based on math. They're not based on whatever. They're just solutions to the problem. Very much the same way as when you play catch with somebody. They're learning how to play catch. Your kid's learning how to play catch. But they're not using physics, not using math to learn how to play catch. They're learning. That's why a system that actually learns and that you train over time and you judge it based on the effectiveness it has in the field in terms of solving the problem is a different kind of relationship you have. It's a different kind of military where we're controlling the training of these systems, and that training is then ported across the military to optimize the weapons that you have. It's a true autonomy versus a kind of an engineered, simulated autonomy that you have with the current robotics. So it's an entirely different kind of thing. It's going to change. It's already changing everything. We're already seeing it in cars, in Tesla, Uber. It's solving that last 10% that turn those self-driving cars into cars that are 10 times safer than driving it yourself. And we'll see it roll out in the next couple of years. It's already happening.
Just sitting and listening to John explain this, I have a very different answer to your question, Sydney. Where I see the problem of sort of over-reliance on technology and algorithms, I don't see it so much as a problem with the way that John's just described it. So Uber knows what its mission is. Its job is to connect people to transportation and get from point A to point B. The algorithms improve on that core object, right? So it's very clear what they're trying to accomplish. What I don't ever want to see happen, and where the human impulse is critical, is not the how we do something, but whether and why we do something. That's what algorithms can't solve the strategy problem. My colleagues wrote an article that came out earlier this year talking about the operational mindset. A lot of people in Washington have the operational mindset. The question isn't whether to take the hill, it's how to take the hill. The algorithms can help you in the how part. They can make it more efficient. They can identify what best practices are. But they're really not going to answer the weather. I can't imagine them answering the weather. And if they do, then we have a real problem on our hands. So that's where we're crossing over into,
Or you could discuss it
dangerous
with them.
area. You
Depends
can
on what
discuss
you're
it,
doing.
right, yeah, yeah.
The
They
only
could
thing I
write
would
awesome
add
papers.
Yeah.
to that is I think, if you haven't read Ghost Fleet, read Ghost Fleet. I think we have a supply chain problem that we haven't got in front of. So there's the algorithms, there's chips, all that kind of stuff. I think the all-volunteer force will actually save us because I think the professionalization of the military will allow us to do things that we're starting to do now in training again, old school, you know, reading the stars to figure out where you are versus GPS. But the second part, I think it's going to challenge, and it already is, the warrior ethos, right? So how the military defines itself as a profession when you have more AI is it's going to be a challenge. I don't think it's insurmountable, but I think those are some of the questions we're starting to explore them with things like UAVs in the Air Force, but I don't think we've completely tapped where that actually might go.
Tammy mentioned Ghost Fleet. If anyone isn't familiar with that, it's a novel that Peter Singer and August Cole released last year. It's kind of a Tom Clancy war novel, but it's set in the future. It's a war between the U.S. and China, and it's really gotten a lot of attention, I mean, among very serious military and defense thinkers. So, you know, as she mentioned, it is both fun to read and well worth your time. Anything else here? Colonel Key.
I am Todd Key. I'm with Strategic Studies Institute, the chairman of research. I think there's a very valuable point that we're touching on that I think we should probably explore a little bit more, which is about rules and about are the rules becoming more important than the purpose of which they were designed to support? And I think that's really where we've got to begin looking, and I offer this for our students here as well, is that, you know, that was one of the issues with the effects-based operations that General Mattis talked about in his letter. I happened to go going through my desk, and I happened to find that old retort back to EBO, and I was very much involved with EBO when it was coming out. And the idea that we would just, because you do X to Y equals Z, correlation versus causality. You know, I think we've really got to think about what are we doing, what's the purpose of what we're doing, and how best do we solve that problem, not just let somebody tell us how that's to be solved. I mean, I think that's what our fundamental attributes of our capability as U.S. fighters and those that think of a similar way is in that vein, is how do we think about what we're doing? Thanks.
I'll just chime in real briefly. And this is not unique to me, but the U.S. military is actually much more Geminian than Clausewitzian, in the sense that there is an effort to quantify, to assume that inputs equal outputs. If you look at a lot of the briefings that are supposed to do effects-based operations back in the day, assess strategic operational success or improvement now, by and large, my guess would be if you look deeply at them, a lot of what's on those darn PowerPoint slides are going to be inputs, assuming an output, which is not correct. I think we have a predilection to quantify a lot of information. A lot of that's driven by Congress. So, I mean, if I'm, you know, ever cursed and serve as a senator, like the first time somebody shows me a stoplight chart, I'm just going to go crazy because I don't think it works that way. So I think a few things would be helpful. One would be more qualitative efforts or an appreciation for that by decision makers as well, both like on the Hill as well as in the field to be able, I mean, you all have been deployed more than any all-volunteer force ever. And I'm sure that on the ground sometimes you just knew something. It was just, and you couldn't, and there was a few qualitative things you might be able to point to, but nothing that you thought would get through a briefing, right? But you were right. In terms of thinking about what we're really doing and the rules that you suggested, I think one area that for me, I haven't figured out yet, I'm a little troubled by, and it was referred to earlier by Chris, but is the precision of weaponry. So that warfare is becoming much more individualized than almost at any point that I can remember in history. So doing an after-action review with one of the OIF corps, meeting with the Intel, the 2 shop, basically them saying, I don't remember when a corps did a manhunt. Like, and we all remember the deck of cards and stuff like that. And I think that's part of, so I'm torn, right? Because some of the precedents that we're setting, I'm not so sure we want to play by, that we would be comfortable with the enemy playing by those same rules. So thus far, a lot of the targets have been limited to non-state actors, enemy combatants. Should we take out Assad with precision-based munitions? Should that barrier start to be broken? And then if it is, that's going to have implications, obviously, for how others target us in warfare. So I think that with technology, there are a lot of instances where we haven't quite played it out. International law is not keeping up. And I think that if anyone has an interest in a rules-based order, it would be the United States. But I think right now, the tyranny of the inbox and the threats right now is making us push aside some of those more medium to longer term issues that I think are going to become very problematic.
Tammy, let me just kind of pull on a thread from what you just said there a little bit. A discussion that I was involved with within the past year at kind of an Army's Future Unified Quest discussion had to deal with that issue of what is a legitimate target. And I mean, you're exactly right that the American mindset when we've used drone and special forces attacks against terrorists and extremists is that we try to avoid killing other than the terrorists and extremists, but if their families, their supporters just happen to be in the building at the same time, you know, that's kind of collateral damage. But we as Americans have long had the mindset that that was what happened over there, but that didn't apply to us.
Yep.
But what about now when the terrorists and the extremists also have a strategic power projection capability? They can hit back here.
And they have Facebook.
If we've got a drone operator, you know, in Nevada, and a terrorist is going, and someone's going to take him out and happens to kill his family at the same time, is that terrorism? If the U.S. military relies on FedEx and UPS for a lot of their logistics, is the UPS guy a legitimate military target at that point?
Exactly, and this goes back to John's discussion, which is why I mentioned Facebook. I mean, it's not hard to figure out. Do you have kids? Do you not have kids? Right? Where do you go? Things like that. So the intel's there. It's just a matter of if that threshold will be crossed. And I totally agree with you. Like once we go there, then is what is good for the goose good for the gander? I hope not, but I can absolutely see the argument that it would shift the norms of the system.
And technically, if UPS is involved in logistics for the U.S. military and someone comes from abroad and kills the UPS guy, that's not terrorism. I mean, because it would be a military target if they're involved in the logistics.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you guys want to jump in on this?
It's a good point, Steve.
You don't want to make the UPS guy a target?
No, I really don't.
Yeah.
Steve raises an excellent point. I think it's the way we have traditionally defined terrorism. Well, traditionally has not included acts against military installations or military personnel, right? Terrorism by my definition is violence or the threat of violence against civilians to induce a political end, right? Military is in a different category. But you're right, the extent to which all these other entities are interacting with the military, then they're legitimate targets, and then, like I said, then maybe we don't call it terrorism anymore. It's just another act of war.
And I personally believe one of the most profound changes in the character of war today is that America's opponents have a strategic power projection capability the same way we did. I mean, the Viet Cong weren't launching attacks in the United States. ISIS is at least attempting to inspire, if not launch them. John?
Yeah, well, ISIS is using social networking pretty effectively to project attacks. Up till a year ago, they did the standard, heavily plan, either ship people to the attack point from Syria or work with the people in country, intensively hand-holding them and then making an attack. Well, those were becoming increasingly easy to disrupt. What they went with in the last year is decentralized attacks, where they just they put all the onus on the individual to do all the planning by themselves, conduct the attack, and during the attack they do or just after the attack they do the pronouncement of fealty, oath of fealty to the caliphate, and bam, they're accepted into the fold, and there's really no way to detect it. I mean, there is no connection up to that point. And it's worked pretty effectively. The number of attacks and the size of the attacks that have occurred are the equal of the planning phase of their attack cycle. Where that points is that you could end up, the way chat programs, the way social networking is developing, is that you could actually automate quite a bit of that with chat, is that you could actually recruit people en masse. By posing, within the context of a scenario, a chat program is very, very, very good. In fact, it's largely indiscriminate. You can't see the difference between the chat program and a human being within a tight context. And playing a role in having a certain narrative, you could get people to fall in love, and they do it often. People fall in love with chat programs.
Hey,
and
I'm right here, John.
They fall in love with chat programs, and what wouldn't they do for love? And you have hundreds of millions of people, billions of people to recruit from online, define those targets and turn them into actors who are acting out some narrative or, in response to some narrative that you as a government don't even know existed. Looks like an online love conversation until it says, save me, shoot this person that's holding me captive, kind of thing.
We have a question from the virtual audience. While our panelists can see it, I'll read it for the benefit of our audience here. Let me apologize if I mispronounce the questioner's name, but it says we have an email from Michael Pellish from the Records Management and Declassification Agency. And the question is, for Dr. Schultz or others, when we discuss our 21st century military, we often quote that only 1% now serve statistic. But our old eyes, but are we perhaps ignoring or overlooking the social and cultural context? Each soldier, sailor, Marine, or Coastie has a unique combination of family, friends, social media accounts, a school, a church, a workplace, if in the Guard or Reserve. Isn't it possible that the 1% who serve represent the 99% who wait and watch, perhaps more than ever before?
I'll just jump in really quick. I'm assuming by wait and watch, the questioner means that they'll jump in if necessary or something like that. So that's how I'm going to take your question, Michael. If I'm misinterpreting that, I'm sorry. I would say a couple of things in terms of why it's sort of the 1%. So one, trusting government has dropped dramatically. So when I was thinking about this question, especially insofar as it involves, as I said, sort of the U.S. citizens' relationship to war, which involves sort of, in my context, like, do you trust the government to do the right thing? And there the numbers are incredibly staggering and dramatic. So in 1958, when the American National Election Study first asked the question, it was 73% who said they could trust the government to do what was right most of the time or often. That number is 19% today. A few things affected that. Certainly Vietnam and Watergate, we see a dramatic drop. It rises after 9/11, and then it drops again during the financial crisis, and we kind of haven't recovered from that. I think that's troubling. So I'm not sure how much of the public, given those figures, is willing to essentially say, yes, I will swear to the Constitution, and I'm willing to give up my life to that Constitution, assuming that the policymakers are making the right choices, right? I'm not sure that that thread is there any longer. The second thing I will say is that I really do think Chris is partly right that there's more neo-isolationism than has existed before. That said, the majority of Americans still do want the United States to play an incredibly active role. One of the interviews I will never forget, it was on 9/11, and a housewife or something had called in, maybe it was 9/12, who basically said she was starting to work out because she thought that she was ready to go if the country needed her. And I loved that. And that civic spirit wasn't harnessed in the ways that I have sort of suggested before. And so I think that might have been a lost opportunity. But for those reasons, I'm not so sure. I think that there is an element of the US public who absolutely would rise up if there were a national security crisis, as Chris alluded to. The problem is the faith in the government that they're actually making the right choices, and choices for which not only are you willing to lay down your life, that's the extreme. How many birthday parties have you guys missed, and gals? How many Christmases? Do you trust the policymakers are sending you places that it's worth that?
I have a slightly different take. The questioner asked, if 1% serves the 99%, they still have this network. Well, when 5 or 6 or 8% of the population served the 92%, they still had that social network. So when you have more people who are serving in the military and have personal experience with it, they have a better chance of conveying accurately to the people who don't serve, what this experience actually entails. Although, again, you can't really replicate it unless you do it yourself. I think this disconnect is a very serious problem, but I actually think it's a part of the reason why it's a serious problem is because it might erode the support for the all-volunteer military, which I'm a passionate advocate of for lots of reasons, mostly because it's more effective, but also for ideological reasons, for personal reasons. And so I think that we have to address this problem of the disconnect between the public and the military in ways that don't entail compelling people to serve against their will. We all need to think really creatively about how to do that. The other quick point is this. Tammy's absolutely right that public trust in government is at a very, very low point, and trust in institutions generally are at a low point. But what is the most respected institution in the United States of America?
Military.
Everybody. The military. The most respected institution in the country. And what I think that means is that whereas most Americans are willing to challenge when political leaders say, this is what we want to do and why we want to do it, they are reluctant to challenge that judgment when it comes to warfare because they worry about the message that sends to the one institution and the people they actually trust and respect. So again, there's an additional obligation. You have enough already. I'm sorry, I'm piling more on your shoulders. You have an additional obligation to make sure that the hard questions are asked before the balloon goes up, right? Before, how do I take that hill? Someone is asking the question, why do I take that hill? Why are we taking that hill? Why are we attacking that particular place, that particular person? Those questions have to be asked before it all starts, because once it all starts, most of the people who never served never want to ask those questions. They just don't want to ask those questions. It's too delicate. They don't feel empowered, they don't feel qualified to ask those questions. So, again, not to put more on your shoulders already, because you guys are already pretty busy.
Let me kind of play off of that to push our thinking a little further into the future rather than the present. I mean, throughout American history, the fact that we rely heavily on citizen soldiers and then the all-volunteer force has been seen as a useful break on the use of military force by our political leaders. I mean, we were created with the idea that European monarchs could go to war right and left because they had these, you know, in effect, a mercenary professional force that was isolated from society. And, you know, therefore, if they died, no big deal. Americans were different, therefore, that raised the bar for the use of military force. But everybody talks about the future of the U.S. military as being heavily roboticized. And we talk particularly about using robotics for the most dangerous task. Does that mean that the U.S. military 20 years from now, when it's heavily roboticized, will make it easier for our political leaders to get involved in wars than they have been in the past? And go ahead, John.
Oh, well, yeah, some of the scenarios I was running when I was doing the JCS concept on robotics is that if you have an opposition force, like say China, that has heavily roboticized or using AI and robotics, you could end up in these, you know, escalatory silos. Like say you take the South China Sea and you have a fight over the Spratlys. You could say, you know, 200 miles, no person's inside, just throw robotics at it. Take the, you know, it's like planting the flag, you know, take the flag, take the ground, but it's all robotics, and they just until the other side gets worn out. The other side runs out of money and effort. So you could potentially have incidents like that because you don't have the loss of life that would lead to a nuclear exchange. We're already seeing that we're more likely to intervene and go into countries when no American life is at risk. And look at the drone policy.
Yep.
Right.
And if you can get to the point where you can actually drop robots that take down a small town or a house with thoroughness rather than just blowing it up, I think we'll see a lot more of that. And that's very, very possible. And it's not in the long term either. We'll be using it much more often. It does raise the question though, because long term we're always focused on the fact that we're in this mass society, and democracy is largely tied to the need to actually mobilize large groups of people for warfare, and that means that you have to have the support of all these people in order to go to war. What happens is if you have a huge percentage of your force actually autonomous robots of various shapes and sizes, and a very, very small force that's easily or more easily controlled by a political actor, is that you don't necessarily need democracy, and you don't need the support of the people anymore, and that it's possible for both software systems and robotic systems to effectively maintain order without the consent. So that's kind of a dark potential path, because an underlying assumption that we have is changing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that because war is cheap, relatively speaking, and growing cheaper to human life, that is the people who are carrying out the attacks, then you have more ill-considered wars. You have wars that aren't actually debated, because they don't actually have to be paid for. No one's taxes have to be increased. No one's other programs have to be cut to pay for them. So there's no need for a debate, let alone the desire for one. That's a problem. I've already pointed out, we're really good at getting involved in wars. We're not so great at finishing them. And so it seems like you're likely to have, this problem's likely to get worse before it gets better. I'd like to think otherwise, but that's what I see playing out right now.
I want to sort of bring something Chris said full circle. I think that's an innovation. Technology is always going to improve, et cetera. I'm not so sure it changes the character. Insofar as, so for instance, it doesn't mean we're going to make better strategic choices.
Right.
Right? So, in fact, if it's so much easier, we may make some very huge strategic missteps. And if I were going to play this even further out, if intervention gets incredibly easy, never mind R2P, responsibility to protect, what does this ultimately do to state sovereignty, right? If intervention becomes that easy, and I actually don't think it will, there's always counters, and there are things that could happen to us in terms of, sort of to go back to the Colonel's point earlier about the precedents we're setting. China has the robots. There's nothing to say they can't drop them in Detroit, or that that may not be a bad idea.
Let me turn, we have another question from the virtual audience, and let me read that to you. It's an email from Dave DeBlay, and the question is, with the tribalism that the social media format seems to be encouraging, and using the evidence of the recent US presidential election and Brexit votes, do you see a higher risk for civil wars in developed countries? How do you rate the chances of a second US civil war, given the seeming distance between Republicans and Democrats, left and right, et cetera? And let me throw out an answer to that myself. While I see increasing ideological, political, cultural fragmentation within the United States, I don't see the chances of a second civil war as high, and here's the reason. Technology is allowing us to move to a point in human history where micro-political units can be economically viable. I mean, it used to be that to be a really successful economy, you had to be a large nation, during the age of industrialization. So who ran the nation mattered greatly. But now we're going to be moving to a point with 3D printing and the internet and new materials and new energy sources where I think that you can have very small, more culturally, politically homogenous units that will still be economically viable. So what I think is going to happen with the U.S. is that we're going to gradually fragment into, I don't know, little blue and red archipelagos where you have economically viable political units that are more unified by culture and politics. So what I'm talking about here is a return to and a more extreme form of federalism, maybe even to the point of feudalism. So there would be no reason to go to war with one of these other little micro units. If you lived in a blue one and your next door neighbor was a red one, as long as you both were economically viable and connected to the global economy and the internet and stuff like that, there would really be no reason to go to war with each other. So I think the trend of tribalism, of kind of fragmentation, is real and serious. I don't think it'll lead to armed conflict.
I almost wrote I wrote an op-ed on this before the election. My doomsday scenario was, what if the election were incredibly close and that it had sort of Hillary Clinton just by a hair's breadth in the lead. And then candidate Trump had sort of suggested there may not be the concession, the normal concession. And what were the odds of it then? I teach ethnic conflict and civil war at Georgetown. So what do you need for a civil war? And I partly agree with you, Steve, but you need the ability to organize, which exists. You need a grievance that is big enough that cannot be addressed through political avenues. That's why people take up violence, right? And so I partly agree with you, Steve, because I agree with the economic point, but I don't think culturally and in terms of mindset, a lot of these groups are sort of, Articles of Confederation time where, I'm a Bostonian or something like that.
Portlandia.
Exactly, right? So, I think the chances are small, for sure, but I don't think that they are non-existent. I think that there are some fractures within the society, socioeconomic, racial, that are potentially bigger than a lot of us in our bubbles understand or realize. Listen to some of the I was talking to Ed earlier, who's my handler guy, listen to some of the call-in programs someday. And what you'll hear is something that is not this kind of discourse. A lot of people felt left behind. A lot of people feel like, and frankly, under President Trump, my fear is actually I have both fears. His promises will be kept. And then the other one is that they won't be. Because I think that a disaffected base from that political system will become more disaffected. And I don't know what that looks like. I think what we saw in this election cycle was different in a lot of respects, and I think one of it was just this complete disassociation from national politics, which either, in my mind, sort of bodes to more micro levels of organization, or if that national identity is held on to, something potentially more.
You might see online parties like they have in Italy right now, the M5S, Movement 5 Star. It's an online party, has very simple rules, and it was basically a no against the government. And it's the biggest party in Italy. It just took out a prime minister. It has the mayorships of Turin and Rome. And they increasingly vote internally to the party on every issue. So if, Trump's not going to do this, but if he had done that and asked the populace or asked his base to vote on the big things that he's going to go press for, that would have been almost an unstoppable force against the Congress. It could have been very effective. But next generation, we'll definitely see in next election some kind of online party or series of online parties that will get increasingly effective at mobilizing a base and then fielding candidates who are basically puppets of the voters. You stick with the current system, but the person you send to Washington isn't really making their own decisions or getting swayed by global money. They're actually just reflecting what the base is voting for online, on their phones.
National referendum.
Every single thing they do, every single thing they put up.
Yeah.
It's very scalable and it's very interactive. You don't just wait every 4 years to have a say. You have a say virtually every day. Politics becomes an ongoing thing that you're constantly involved in.
And then it would probably depend upon what they want
Yeah,
to do
and I
with that
seem to
power.
recall reading in the Constitution, the founders were pretty down on that sort of thing. I seem to
Especially
remember that. I'm going to go
Jefferson.
back and double
Yeah.
check, but I'm pretty sure they weren't enthused about that prospect.
It's a
so.
different age.
Yeah, I know.
We have a different information flow, different expectations. We expect things to change fast.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can't touch the political establishment except for every 2 years is just,
It's a
from
source of
my perspective-
frustration.
And they get affected by all that global money that constantly pours in and affects their votes, changes how they approach stuff, and nothing gets changed. Get the same thing every year.
Somebody else from the, yeah, in the back there, sir?
Hey, sir, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Koppelman, thanks for your time today. I have a question for Dr. Preble, and the question is concerning risk. And in particular, in light of the piece you wrote that was on War on the Rocks on new rules for U.S. military intervention. Several of the things that you advocate in that piece, they all seem to increase risk. I mean, risk to mission, risk to force, but, risk of a strategic loss. And those examples would be, you advocate for a strict definition of vital interests and to specifically exclude vital interests of our allies, the use of force as a last resort.
Right.
You advocate to draw a line or a threshold under which, U.S. military force wouldn't be used, which potentially could obviously open up, when you remove the conventional deterrent that we pose, malign non-state actors or other belligerents would then potentially feel free to run amok underneath that red line. And then lastly, the built-in presumption that force would be used last. So
Right.
I wonder, if you could address though,
Sure.
how, with all of those increasing risk, why would we ever wait until the threat was on our shore, existential or actually on our soil, before
Right.
taking care of it, where we could do so as a military with much lower risk to us when it's away from the shore and when it may be only an important national interest and not a vital national interest?
Right. No, thank you for your question. This work that I've done on rules goes back actually to my work, my book called The Power Problem, which addresses what I see as every problem is a nail, and we've got a really big hammer. And the best articulation of this was when Madeleine Albright said to Colin Powell, "What's the point of the superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it?" So I was thinking very hard about, well, what kind of criteria could we impose, or at least some considerations to take into account to address the power problem? Because the old sort of structural realist in an IR theory doesn't apply. The United States' freedom of action is virtually unlimited. There are no actors that are going to stop us from doing certain things. They can make it hard for us to achieve our objectives, but they can't stop us from starting things. And so yes, the criteria that I spelled out are very stringent. They would make it far less likely for the United States to start new wars. Guilty as charged. But the reason why I say that is twofold. First, I believe that our strategic situation is very fortuitous. In other words, I defy you to find any other country in the world that would not, in a heartbeat, trade places with the United States right away. We are in a very strong position strategically, economically, and in spite of all our challenges politically. And therefore, the need for us to act in a preventive way far away is low. Those circumstances are low. The second reason is you address the likelihood that malign actors will take advantage of a vacuum left behind by the United States. And that is a possibility. But I also believe that benign actors, that is, people who share our objectives in terms of keeping this global economic system functioning, will also act. It is not merely ceding the ground to malign actors. In fact, I look around at the roster of allies and strategic partners that the United States has and believe they are already very capable and would become slightly more capable if they were encouraged to be more capable. And of course, the United States has been discouraging that. Someone referenced, I think yesterday or today, that the United States' position since the end of the Cold War was to discourage the emergence of any rivals, not merely our adversaries, but also our allies, from ever aspiring to a larger global role. That was the decision that was made in 1992. I can understand why they made that decision in 1992. I look at the mood of the country 25 years later and our willingness to sustain this indefinitely for another 25 or 50 years. I don't see it. I think we need a new arrangement where the United States is first and foremost concerned about its vital national interests, other countries are concerned about theirs, and that most of the time those interests actually align, which means that it's actually pretty easy to get cooperation with our allies and partners. So yes, I thank you for reading the article. I love War on the Rocks. I'm a big fan. And they gave us an opportunity to make our case, and that's where it all comes from.
Dr. Metz, I believe we've got time for one more question, or if you would prefer, maybe closing comments from each of the speakers.
Is there another question? Okay, well, let me throw out one myself. And this is also an idea that kind of popped into my head during one of these unified quest exercises, and also one that kind of looks to the long-term future. One thing the Army is really big on is a broad range of programs called soldier enhancement. I mean, this is exoskeletons, it potentially could be implants, potentially could be drugs, you know, all sorts of things. If the Army continues along that path to where we have, to where we, in effect, create, even engineer super soldiers, do you think that will have domestic repercussions, will have political, ethical, legal pushback?
I'll let you take that one, John.
Oh,
That's more of a John Robb question.
My answer is yes. Over to you, John.
Yeah, I don't see that as a fruitful direction in the main. I think the longer-term goal and the more fruitful direction is to focus on turning soldiers into trainers of deep learning AI-based robotics. I mean, and systems that just live entirely online, and training them to be really, really good. I mean, that means hand-holding them, looking at their effectiveness in the field, working with them day in, day out to develop solutions to things that may confront us in the future, and then sharing that throughout the force, getting it vetted, and then getting it spread out. And doing that is a full-time job for any military, and any company right now, they're all doing that going forward. I mean, every single Tesla driver is driving, and they're actually training in AI every day. You know, they're personalizing it. They have an $8,000 computer inside a Tesla, a GPU array, and it's housed the AI, and they're training it. And everything from the driving to mission autonomy. I mean, how do I train this thing that works alongside me, that takes most of the physical burden and most of the physical risk, but train them to be very, very good at their job?
Unlike these guys, Steve, I don't think your question was stupid.
But, you know, as I often say, I found out in my career that people thinking your points are stupid only stings the first 50 or 60,000 times, and you get used to it. So.
I think one area that exoskeletons and the like, I mean, they're here, they're going to keep developing. I agree with everything you said, John, but women in combat, non-issue. Like a lot of the arguments being made about upper body strength, all that kind of stuff. I think that we're getting close enough that we're almost already there. And so instead of rehashing, in some case, well-meaning arguments, in other case, thinly veiled misogyny, it should just be, this is coming. How do we integrate these units better?
Let John's point kind of roll around in your head. There is a possibility that for the lieutenants of today, by the time they become colonels and generals, military leadership may no longer be training men and women, but be primarily training machines.
Yep.
And that's a big change.
All right. I'd like to thank this panel